we welcome back Jane Oneail. If you haven't attended one of these presentations before, Jane Oneail holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Currier Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. Her nonprofit is called Culturally Curious. Culturally Curious's mission is to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated arts experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as an appreciation for our shared humanity. Tonight, she's going to present the secret stories behind the world's most iconic paintings, from American Gothic to Whistler's mother to Nighthawks. There are some images that are so ubiquitous in our culture that we have stopped looking at them closely. This program delves into the iconic works and shares the secret stories behind their creation and reception. If you have any questions for Jane over the course of the program, please direct those to the chat or use the Q&A module, and we will be sure to get to those at the end of the program. Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you again to everybody for joining us. I am always humbled that people take time out of their day to learn a little bit more about art history with me. And like the program description says, this is a fun one because we are getting sort of more familiar with images that already feel like friends to us, images that that are really kind of woven into the fabric of our lives. We see them everywhere. They're parodied. We'll be getting back to this image later on, but I wanted to give you a sense in terms of really what it meant to be iconic before we got started today. So we've got our American Gothic parody right over here with Kermit and Miss Piggy, and notice that the gender roles here have been switched. We've got our send up of the girl with the pearl earrings, a la the Simpsons, and then the Nighthawks over here with people hanging out because of free Wi-Fi. So what does it mean to be iconic? It doesn't just mean that you're going to be parodied a lot or appropriated a lot, although that's certainly a part of it. It means that these are works, the works that we'll be looking at tonight, that are widely recognized, very well established, sort of in the same way that like Coca-Cola is an iconic brand. So what's especially important for our purposes tonight is that being iconic often means you are acknowledged for distinctive excellence. There's something about these works that is extremely well done. And what we'll also see is there tends to be a lot of ambiguity with these works as well. They've become cultural touchstones for us, and they help us make sense out of other relationships and new things in our world, which is why we see them appropriated this way. Now, when it comes to the history of art, icon means something a little bit different. Icons specifically refer to works of art, very flat works of art, with oftentimes with gold backgrounds, that come out of sort of the Gothic era, images of saints, images of Mary and Jesus, and these decidedly flat images were used as almost like stand-ins for the divine. They were images that were used for worship, for reverence. And of course, Andy Warhol turns that on its head in the 1960s when he starts depicting celebrities as religious icons, as we can see with the gold Marilyn over there. So now we're worshiping images that could be three-dimensional or flat or what have you, but they are images that have some sort of quasi-sacred meaning in our lives. So I wanted to go back to the Nighthawks very quickly. If you've been to my programs before, you know we go through a lot of images very quickly, but somehow I completely miscalculated when it came to this program. I actually created a program that was twice as long as it needed to be. So we're going to have a Secret Stories Part 2 in January January of 2023. It's all ready to go. And it has more of the Nighthawks in it. But since the program description had some Nighthawks, a reference to Nighthawks, I wanted to touch on it a little bit. And we just saw it parodied, so why not just return to it for a moment? It's a great example of an iconic image because it's one that we've seen so many send-ups of over the years, but we don't really know much about sort of the place and the meaning behind it. So incidentally, there are diners all over New York City that claim to be the Nighthawks diner. It's been sort of most art historians, I should say, have sort of come to the conclusion that this particular spot probably is an invention by Edward Hopper in this case. But we do know a few really kind of tantalizing details about this work. First, we know that Edward Hopper and his wife served as models for most of the figures in this work. His wife was a great chronicler of his artistic output and his efforts. So she gives us a little bit of insight along the way. And we also know that Edward Hopper, who loved cinema, who loved to go to the movies, especially when he was feeling creatively blocked, actually storyboarded this image in particular. So it sort of plays out like a movie in so many ways. It has this great relationship to film noir. He sort of starts off with the idea of the setting. He starts filling in the characters and their spatial relationships here. And then we can see in a more finished sketch, details that didn't even make it into the final work. Things like, my eye always goes to, the text on the glass here, referencing, I think, lunch and dinner and sodas and that sort of thing. Over here, these are just huge plate glass windows that we peer into almost as though we're looking at fish in an aquarium. Now, Edward Hopper said, the drawings are reality, the paintings are where the creativity comes in. So we noticed that he omitted the text there. He made a great big sidewalk instead as well. But the end result is that these plate glass windows sort of function like movie screens themselves. And so we're imagining these relationships. I think we lend so much to these relationships because it seems like we are peering in on a story that is in the middle of being told. Incidentally, the reason why this famous work is called Nighthawks, that's maybe something else that you've never considered before, is because of Edward Hopper's wife, Jo, who we can see here as the model. She referred to this male character sitting next to her as having a beakish nose, hence the term hawk and nighthawks. So sort of a simple reason behind that particular work. As we move through the works today, we're going to have everything from the simple and the satisfying to sometimes the surprisingly convoluted. So it's sort of a shorter program today, and just a few images for each of these sections, but we're kind of diving in, and I'm giving you as much visual context as possible too. So like I said, we'll be getting back to American Gothic, but here we are staring at that farmer once again. The first half of the program is going to be famous faces and figures, and then the second half is intriguing couples. And when we do part two, it's going to be like gods and heroes and imagined spaces. That's when we'll get to Van Gogh and Michelangelo. There's so much to cover there. So that will be January, and hopefully I will see you then. All right, so let's get started with some famous faces. I love always starting off as often as possible with the most famous face in the world. And this is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa from 1503. It's at the Louvre Museum in Paris, the most famous painting on the planet. And when it comes to this painting, there are certain things that we know. For example, art historians are pretty certain on the fact that this is a portrait of a woman named Lisa Gherardini, and that we know that Da Vinci was 51 years old when he painted her. Now, we also know that one of the most exceptional, outstanding elements of the Mona Lisa is that he was using an innovative new way to create shade and shadow to describe her face and hands. hands. The Italians called this hazy blending of shadow, sfumato. And it's where you see the shade coming in her temples, underneath her chin over here, describing the three-dimensionality of her hands. Prior to this, you have artists like Botticelli, who we'll look at next month, who used a pretty hard black outline to describe things like the edge of a nose. You don't see any hard lines describing anything on the Mona Lisa's face. It's all of these soft, smudgy, hazy shadows here. And the result is pretty astonishingly lifelike, which is probably why Da Vinci was particularly proud of this work. He kept it with him for the next 17 years, and that has prompted a lot of art historians to explore, what was the particular significance of this work to Da Vinci? And I also have come to realize that a lot of researchers like to throw a little Mona Lisa into their work because it tends to get them a lot of attention. If there's a new way to see an old painting, people are all ears. So there's a lot of theories out there, and a lot of them get discredited pretty quickly. One of them was that this is, in fact, a self-portrait by Leonardo da Vinci. We can see him here, probably about a decade or two after he painted the Mona Lisa. But researchers have tried to overlay his proportions onto hers. I think that's been largely discredited. There's also been some thinking that that there are almost microscopic letters painted in her eyeballs that correspond to his initials, and maybe hers, maybe somebody else's. That's been discredited. One art historian also said that, or I think it's been probably promoted by a lot of people over the years, the idea that the Mona Lisa's eyes follow you no matter where you are in the room, because she's sitting at 3/4 profile, and her eyes are in the corner of their eye sockets. That has also been disproven. So one last theory that I wanted to share with you too that has also been disproven is this idea that this is a painting that has been cut down over the ages. I've heard this, and I've actually shared that in presentations in the past, because I've noticed that what looked like the edges of columns down here. So it made sense to me that there were probably columns painted into this work. But since then, art historians have been able to examine this painting without the frame on it, and Da Vinci actually left a reserve all around the edges, so we know where he stopped painting. You can't see that when the frame is on, but we also know that this painting was championed, was celebrated after its creation because of Da Vinci's use of so-called divine proportions, or the divine ratio. That goes back to a simple geometric relationship between the elements of the painting. So the golden ratio comes from a rectangle that, when you subdivide it into a perfect square and a smaller subsequent rectangle, that smaller rectangle has the same aspect ratio as the original larger rectangle. And that, you can see, happens with the Mona Lisa no matter how you divide her up. So she probably wasn't cut down at any point. This was considered so kind of revolutionary in art. Again, art historians were referring to this as the divine ratio. It's that important. It's that perfect to them. So one of the intriguing elements of the Mona Lisa that I wanted to share with you relates to her eyes. Once again, not the Mona Lisa smile tonight. It's about her eyes, and the fact that she does not seem to have eyelashes or eyebrows. Now, I read some time ago that it was sort of an overzealous art restorer who was cleaning the painting who actually kind of eliminated her eyebrows and eyelashes in the process. And there is just one hair, microscopic hair, that was left behind that tells us that she did probably have some eyebrows at the very least. Recent evidence has also shown us a little bit more about the Mona Lisa. There is this painting that is obviously a copy of the Mona Lisa that's located in the Prado Museum in Spain. And for centuries, art historians assumed that this was a knockoff done, decades, if not centuries, after Da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. And it was viewed as sort of like a cheap knockoff knock off to a certain extent, because instead of painting this fantastic imagined background with, the jagged cliffs and the winding roads and the waterways, obviously the artist over here just painted black. It seems like a real, quick and easy way to fill in a painting. But just 10 years ago, this painting over here on the right was cleaned. And during that process, it was revealed that there is actually a fantastic imagined landscape behind this figure over here as well. Notice the columns too. But what I'm very interested in is that she has noticeable eyebrows over here. So we do know that the Mona Lisa had a little more facial hair than we see her with today. One other fun fact that I will leave you with about the Mona Lisa is that she is not the only Mona Lisa in the Louvre Museum. There is another one, and fun fact, she is nude. She was probably painted by the same artist that painted the copy over here, almost certainly one of Leonardo da Vinci's students. Art historians are almost at the point of agreeing which of his students it was too. So that you can definitely shock a few friends and family with over the next few days, that there's a nude Mona Lisa at the Louvre as well. We're going to turn our attention now to a painting that is oftentimes called the Mona Lisa of the North. And she is a very familiar face, particularly in recent years. There's been the book, there's been the movie, there's been a stage play, all inspired by this beautiful young woman who is still nameless to us. This is, of course, Vermeer's painting, Girl with a Pearl Earring from 1665. This is at the Marithuis Museum in The Hague, Netherlands. Now, we love to speculate on her identity, particularly because of the book, which posited that she was a servant in Vermeer's household. Art historians are closer to agreeing on the idea that perhaps she was the daughter, the oldest of Vermeer's 10 children, who maybe posed for this. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Because in the end, the identity doesn't seem to matter that much. This is not a portrait. This is what art historians refer to as a trony. Tronies were paintings of faces, not portraits of specific people, but sort of experiments for artists to either try out almost exaggerated facial expressions. Rembrandt was really good at doing sort of bizarre facial expressions for tronies, or to paint something that seemed exotic for the time. And the headdress that she is wearing here certainly makes her exotic. It's not the sort of thing that women would have been wearing in Northern Europe at the time. So, as I mentioned, art historians are leaning closer to the idea that in fact, the model for this work was probably Vermeer's daughter. And they believe that she probably posed for several of his works, including the allegory of painting that we see over here. The facial characteristics look pretty similar, pretty consistent. But there's a whole other school of art historians that believe that this same daughter probably studied under her father and made works in her own right, that she was an artist herself. And those same art historians ascribed several of the works that are traditionally credited to Vermeer as being, in fact, paintings by his daughter. These are sometimes known as like misfit Vermeers. Notice that all of these women are wearing that same pearl earring. So let's go back to that pearl earring just for a second, because this is one of the most fun facts about this painting. In recent years, an astrophysicist actually examined the reflection of this pearl and determined that it is not a pearl at all, that instead it's just lacquered glass. It's kind of cheap jewelry, in fact. And this probably shouldn't come as a surprise to us, because a pearl that's that big would have belonged to like king or queen, probably not an artist or his model. So from this day forward, we shall refer to her as girl with the fake pearl earring. Let's turn our attention now from the glimmer of a pearl to this kind of incredible abundance of precise and minute detail. We are looking at Sir John Everett Millet's painting, Ophelia, which is at the Tate Britain. This is really an early pre-Raphaelite masterwork, a British work here that's really emblematic of the movement. It has these incredible depictions of minute and symbolic details in nature. I mean, look at the way the grass has been captured over here, the stump and roots of this tree, the little bird sitting over here on the branch, all of the flowers along this riverbed. And so along with that, we have historical and literary references kind of embedded in this. So Ophelia, we know that we are looking at a scene from Shakespeare's Hamlet, where Ophelia, who's sort of Hamlet's love interest, is driven mad because her father has been murdered by her lover, and she essentially drowns herself in this waterway. And we see her in this painting taking this last tragic breath at the end of her life. So the artist here, Sir John Everett Bellay, camped out on the edge of this waterway for about 4 months over the course of a summer, painstakingly capturing the details of the moss and of the grass, of the bark, and that sort of thing. And it wasn't an easy task for him at all, because what he referred to as very muscular flies that were sort of abusing him. He also got into some trouble with the landowner that whose land he kind of had to walk through to get to this spot. But in the end, it provided like this wealth of information that he was able to capture. Now, another element of pre-Raphaelite painting, and one of the things that I think just makes this painting sing, is the attention to flowers and their symbolic detail here. So we've got this chain of violets around Ophelia's neck. Violets stand for faithfulness, chastity, or death. In this case, they could refer to any of them. We've got a rose right here corresponding to her eyes that may allude to the fact that her brother in Hamlet refers to her as the Rose of May. All of these flowers have symbolic meaning. I won't go into all of them, but of course, right down here is a poppy, which is associated with sleep and with death. Think of the Wizard of Oz and like the field of poppies. Poppies will make her sleep. So, so there's all of this incredible natural detail here, really rich with symbolic importance. Now, the figure of Ophelia was not painted on site. She was added afterwards. And we know some really interesting details about the model and about the process in this case. The image over here on the right is a study for Ophelia with the model, whose name was Elizabeth Seidel. We can see her over here in a portrait by another pre-Raphaelite artist, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was really the leader of the movement, who ends up marrying Elizabeth Seidel, who's actually an artist in her own right. So Seidel agreed to pose in a bathtub over the course of about another 4 months during the winter in this big, heavy, old-fashioned dress to really sort of conjure the spirit of Ophelia, while Millet is carefully trying to record everything about her skin and her hair and the dress floating in this water. Now she's in this tin bathtub, and they were trying to keep the water warm for her by having some lamps lit underneath. And there's this famous story about how, as she was posing, one day the lamps went out, and she apparently caught, according to some art historians, a cold. Other art historians claim she caught pneumonia. In any event, she did get sick enough that her father had to hunt down the artist and demand that he pay her hospital bills or else. And in the end, Millet said that creating this iconic work here was such a tumultuous process that it, quote, would have been a greater punishment to a murderer than hanging, to go through the process that he went through. Very melodramatic, just in line with pre-Raphaelite painting. But of course, this stands out today as one of the best pre-Raphaelite paintings ever. So we're going to turn our attention away from our drowning Ophelia to yet another version of the Mona Lisa, maybe the American version, or the Victorian version of the Mona Lisa. This is, of course, Whistler's Mother, painted by the American expatriate artist James McNeill, or James Abbott McNeill Whistler. This is from 1871. And just to give you a sense of just how important this work is, it's at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And let me tell you, the Parisians aren't just going to accept any old non-Parisian painting into their hallowed halls, into their museums there. So let's let's talk a little bit about how this famous painting came to be. First off, Whistler was living in London, and he had actually gotten a grant to paint a portrait of his daughter. She kind of flaked on him. She didn't want to pose for it, but his mother was so devoted to him. She said she would pose for him instead. And over the course of several days, she stood up like a statue, trying to be a good, diligent model for him, but was uncomfortable doing so. So ultimately, they compromised on this pose so she could be comfortable. So he ends up painting, not the original model and not the original plan for the pose either. And so the end result is this kind of stiff profile picture of a woman who looks, sort of puritanical to contemporary Victorian eyes at the time, in a composition that is so restrained in terms of its use of color. It's basically just like browns, grays, blacks, whites. So what is this painting all about? How has it captured our imagination in such a powerful way? Well, it fits into a story of an artistic movement in a fascinating way. And then it had this whole kind of renewed understanding for Americans decades later. So I want to give you a sense in terms of how it fits into the story of, modern art really in London at the end of the 19th century. Whistler, our artist here, had begun promoting this idea that art didn't have to teach a lesson or make us more moral. Art could just be for art's sake. And so to promote that idea, he began naming his pictures after musical movements and compositions, giving them titles in their own right. But if you name them music, nobody ever says music has to elevate your mind or your body or your soul. You can just enjoy music. And that's what he was sort of promoting with this idea of art for art's sake. So he starts off with his famous painting, The Little White Girl, which he called the Symphony in White from 1862, a scandalous painting in its own right, because we see this girl in white against a white background. She's holding this wilted flower on a wolf or bearskin rug here. The critics said she looks like a traumatized bride after her wedding night. But Whistler said, he was just experimenting with color here for the most part. And he actually started this whole craze of white on white paintings. But initially, people really kind of bristled at what he was doing. Then about a decade later, he paints this portrait of his mother, which he also names after a musical composition, arrangement in black and gray. And for the most part, we see a straightforward, realistic depiction of his mother. Still a restrained palette here, but nothing as surprising as what we saw with The Little White Girl. But whenever I look at the portrait of Whistler's mother, I'm reminded of where he goes almost immediately after that, to something that looks strikingly abstract, strikingly modern in comparison. This is a painting, probably his most famous painting, called Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, from the year after the painting of his mother. It's at, the Detroit Institute of Art. And it's literally a painting of essentially fireworks that are falling down over a river, and you can see a few figures here just subtly suggested. Now, this is so modern, so avant-garde that the British critic John Ruskin equated it to flinging a pot of paint in the face of the public. Our artist here, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, ended up taking that same critic to court for libel and ultimately won, saying that, this isn't, that you can create a modern work, an abstract work, and it's not something that artists can tear you down for doing. It was a hollow victory in the end because the judge only awarded him 1 farthing, which is like the equivalent of like 1/1000th of a penny. So it was all kind of for nothing. But basically, we see him in Whistler's mother sort of moving towards that abstraction that we see in the falling rocket. Look at this pattern, this loose pattern in in the drapery in front of his mother that he's sort of playing with, having fun with. He's creating this visual melody to extend his musical metaphor here that we see kind of loosening up with the fallen rocket just a year later. So we can see this as like this close connection to the little white girl and to what's coming afterwards. But let's also consider for a moment why this work means so much to us as Americans. I wanted to share this image because every time I see it, I'm always surprised at how big this painting is. It's surprisingly big. She's practically life size here. Now, this is a painting that was created in Europe. It lives in Europe today, but it did come and travel around the United States in the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression. And Americans saw her for this kind of stoicism and this grit, and these sort of Puritan values, and they resonated at that time. They loved this woman for how tough she seemed. In fact, there was a monument created to the woman in the painting in the 1930s. This was made in 1938. It's in Ashland, Pennsylvania. It's a sculpture of the woman, of Whistler's mother in the painting. I think all of the stonework was added after the fact by the WPA, but you can see on the monument, it says, a mother is the holiest thing alive. So with this painting, Whistler captured this notion of womanhood, of motherhood that particularly connected during the dark days of the Depression and has kind of held this fascination for us ever since. So we have one last important face/figure to look at. We're going to go from Whistler's avant-garde painting to Andrew Wyeth and his famous realist painting that seems to, in many ways, kind of shut out the modern world. This is, of course, Christina's World, painted in 1948. It's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. This, unlike the other works that we've looked at, is an egg tempera painting, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we're looking at some of the details here. This was painted when the artist was just 31 years old, and it was purchased by the museum for the equivalent of $15,000 in today's money. Not a bad payday. So why does this painting continue to fascinate us today? I think it prompts so many questions. We're thinking, why is she on the ground? What is she looking at the distance? There are elements of mystery and intrigue here that invite us to look closer, but she's also facing away from us. We project ourselves into her body and we imagine how we might be feeling if we were lying on that ground in the same way. So at its core, Christina's World is a psychological landscape. We are prompted to think about her aspirations, her life circumstance. We are prompted to take on her view of the world. Now, I wanted to quickly bring in another iconic work here to show how what Wyeth is doing with Christina's World is almost a tried and true formula in some ways. On the left is David Caspar Friedrich's painting, Wander Above a Sea of Clouds. This was painted, or Sea of Fog, I should say. This was painted in 1818. It's a German painting. It really far precedes Andrew Wyeth's work, but we can see in so many ways, it's the male counterpoint to what Wyeth is doing here. It's a standing erect male figure that we see from behind. Once again, we project ourselves into his body. We are looking at the world through his eyes. Notice the confidence of this pose. Imagine putting your foot up on a rock like that. It's like the classic, almost like Captain Morgan's pose. It's triumphant, it's congratulatory. And even though we don't have a solid understanding of what the landscape looks like in front of him because of this fog, because of this mist, there is this sense that he is the master of this landscape, that he can control it and can dominate it because of this pose here. We've got these cool colors that dominate, and it's a vertically oriented picture. Now, all of that changes when we move over to Christina's World on the other side of the screen. It's horizontally oriented. She is not standing upright. She is lying there in this kind of vulnerable position, not looking down at land that she can dominate, but instead looking up a hill and looking powerless here. We have these warm tones, this kind of golden green grass and the pale pink dress that she's wearing. So it's a real kind of counterpunch to this original work that we see over on the left here. Now, there's a lot that we don't know about this work on the left, but since this Christina's World was created in the modern era, we do know some things about the model and the making of this work that can sort of fill in the gaps when it comes to understanding Christina's World. So here we have a photograph of the artist and the model. As I mentioned, Wyeth was 31 when he painted this work, and Christina was 24 years older than he was. This is her brother, by the way. They lived on this farm in Cushing, Maine, and originally the farm was introduced, and well, the farm and its occupants, its owners, were introduced to Wyeth by way of his girlfriend who would become his wife. He was really taken by the property, and after painting there, sort of using it as like a studio for about a year, he became fascinated with Anna Christina Olsen and her life circumstances. He said about her, she was queen-like, she was Maine. And of course, if you know anything about the painting, you know that she suffered from a degenerative muscular condition in her legs, which meant that she lacked mobility, essentially. And she decided to not use a wheelchair or crutches to get around. She was determined to not use those things. So she pulled herself around her farm using her arms. And Andrew Wyeth was fascinated by this and painted her in a number of times over the course of her life. Here's another example that quickly precedes Christina's World here. So let's zero in on a number of the details about this painting that I think are so incredible. So because it's this egg tempera style of painting where you can't really easily blend colors the same way that you would with an oil painting, we see every individual brushstrokes. We can see how sort of wind whipped her hair is. It's this other element to the picture that gives us this sense of a little bit of chaos, maybe a little bit of panic, and the danger and vulnerability that we sense that she is experiencing in this moment. I also wanted to point out how, slender her arms are, but how massive and sort of gnarled her hands are in comparison. This might have been a mistake on the part of the artist. Maybe it was an attempt to try and describe her rootedness to the ground. But we do know that it was that his future wife, Betsy, also helped to pose for the figure of Anna Christina here. So it's sort of a mix of their bodies. So it's interesting to think, are those Anna Christina's hands and or Betsy's hands in this case? A few more just fascinating details here. Way off in the distance is that farm that she lived in. And if we zoom in, we can see this outbuilding over here. There is a group of blackbirds that seem to be flying around that upper window. I mean, we barely even register that when we look at the painting as a whole. And up here by the farm building, or the farmhouse, there are these little outbuildings and one solitary piece of laundry hanging on a line, sort of whipping in the wind the same way her hair is. But as we zoom in, I mean, look at every individual shutter and shingle here that has been described with his paintbrush. It took him apparently about 2 months just to do the grasses in the foreground. So that is probably the reason why this painting still continues to fascinate today. People make that pilgrimage up to Cushing, Maine, just so that they can kind of lie in the grass and recreate Christina's pose. I think we feel really close to her because Andrew Wyeth allowed all of us to project ourselves into her. He felt very close to her. He actually requested that he be buried right near her at this property in Maine. So with that, we're going to shift gears. We're a little bit behind, but here we are with our intriguing couples. One is so fun. When it comes to two, it can be even more beguiling because we've got the interplay of the personal dynamics here and the ability to read well, read body language. So we're going to start off with one of the most famous couples in the world. You might know it as like the Arnolfini wedding painting. Today, it's just called Double Portrait. It's in the collection of the National Gallery in London, painted by Jan van Eyck in 1434. You know you're an iconic painting when people are in COVID lockdown and they're recreating you. This is an exceptional oil painting, and it's very small. I wanted to give you a sense of the scale here because we're going to be zooming in on a few of the details, and they are mind-boggling to say the least. So going back to the painting itself, I want to start off by myth busting right off the bat. We traditionally said that this was a wedding painting. The dates in terms of the weddings here don't quite line up. We know that this is an Italian gentleman named Arnolfini. We know that he had 2 brides, and this was painted after the first one had died, but I believe before he had married the second one. So this might be a posthumous portrait. We just don't know the exact details as to the how and why and what of this picture, but we do know that she is not pregnant, that this was just the style for the time. Here is a contemporary painting of St. Catherine. You can see that she's wearing the exact same kind of dress with it sort of bundled up around her abdomen. I really hope that this kind of pear-shaped body comes back in style soon. All right, so to zoom in here, as I mentioned, this is oil painting, and Jan van Eyck, for a brief time, is thought to have invented oil painting. We know today he didn't do that, but he really mastered it. Look at his ability to describe these different materials, from the fur-lined dress to this kind of lace edging of her headdress, the little braid here, the carving in the wood. His ability to describe the material world is really second to none. So let's take apart this painting according to some of the symbols it includes, and talk a little bit about why those symbols have lent themselves to a particular interpretation of this work. So this work is filled with symbols that refer to love, marriage, and childbearing, but not the belly in this case. So let's start over here. We've got some oranges on the windowsill and on this chest over here. Typically in the history of painting, fruit was a symbol of fertility. And so that might speak to a very fertile body, fertile marriage. Right down front and center, we have this kind of funny looking dog here with the sweet face. And dogs have always stood for symbols of fidelity. That's why we call dogs Fido, fidelity. So love and fidelity front and center. And in addition to that, we also see that these figures have taken off their shoes, almost as though this is a sacred space, that something like a wedding is unfolding here. I do want to briefly note that this gesture that they're sharing is a really unusual gesture. It doesn't seem to signal love or affection. When's the last time you held somebody's hand like this? So there's other theories floating around out there that this could be like the consummation of a business deal instead of a marriage. But there's a few tantalizing details towards the back of the painting as well. This head post right here, or the bedpost, has a carved figure of Saint Margaret, who was the patron saint of childbirth. We also have a chandelier with 1 candle lit on it, completely unnecessarily, because this is the middle of the day. So art historians understand that could be a reference to the eye of God. The eye of God could also be suggested in this circular convex mirror at the back of the room. This mirror seems to kind of hold the entire secret to the painting for us. And we can see that it seems significant to the artist too, because he signed his name in the middle of the picture over this mirror. So alongside it, there are prayer beads, and framing it, there are these little roundels which represent scenes from the Passion of Christ and Jesus's life. So all of this is kind of enshrined through Christianity. And in this mirror, we can see a reflection of the back of the protagonists in this scene. And we can also see past them to the point in the room where we, the viewers, would be standing. tantalizingly see two more people included in the scene. And these are just like little tiny brushstrokes, essentially. This is a minute detail on an already small painting. We see one of these figures is wearing blue and one of them is wearing red. And there is an image that is presumed to be a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck wearing a red turban. And so we think that he probably included himself right here at the center of this painting that he was no doubt very proud about. So without a doubt, something really important, it seems to be unfolding in this space. And the fact that we never know for certain is probably why we will always be intrigued by this particular work. We're going to turn our attention away from that very awkward handhold to a less ambiguous proclamation of love between two individuals. At least at first, it seems less ambiguous. So we are, of course, looking at Gustav Klimt's famous painting, The Kiss, also known as The Lovers, from 1907-1908. This is at the Gallery Belvedere in Vienna, Austria. This was painted at the height of Gustav Klimt's gold period. It should be emphasized that Gustav Klimt was painting in a revolutionary style for a very modern, for uptight Vienna at the time. And we'll talk a little bit about how this painting and his other works really ruffled feathers. This is sort of a mix of different styles, informed by different styles, a little bit Art Nouveau, a little bit arts and crafts, and a little bit of Byzantine mosaics, all folded into one. Gustav Klimt, as the son of a goldsmith, really understood the power that gold can confer to a work of art. It makes it desirable. It makes it sacred. And of course, that's a lesson that Andy Warhol learns and shares with us just a few decades later. So it seems like a dazzling testament to romantic love. We've got this couple kind of enveloped in this golden envelope, really, where they are both distinct and one at the same time. He has a robe that is composed of a few little swirls like this, but primarily of these upright rectangles in white and black and gray. She is distinct from him with this colorful floral round circular motif in her robes, but they are one on this grassy flowery field that seems to abruptly end right at her feet here. There's this drop, this precipice there. Now we think of this as romantic love. This is the poster that is in every college dorm room because every young woman wants to be adored this way. So let's see if we can sort of crack open this painting and understand it in new terms. I wanted to share with you a study for this painting that reveals, I think, sort of how Klimt himself was struggling with the notion that his work, his paintings in Vienna were actually considered pornographic. I told you, Vienna was a little bit uptight. He had just finished a mural series, that a cycle of murals, essentially, that had a lot of nudity and a lot of flesh, and people were aghast by it. And so when he was planning out this picture, I love this study because we can see that the figures are actually standing up, embracing each other in a different way. We see their feet down here, the edge of the cliff over here. But in this initial study, he had planned to show the woman's bare bottom peeking out from this embrace, but I think ultimately edited that out. There's something still really sort of sensual and sexual about the finished work. We almost get the sense that that these two figures have just consummated their love in something that seems sort of ritualistic. They're wearing these crowns. It seems as though they've maybe just donned these robes. This embrace seems so intense, and the setting seems so romantic. But as we zoom into their poses here, some of this kind of comes apart. He is leaning in and kissing her face, which could be sort of read as in the throes of ecstasy, or really sort of chilly, cold. Notice how his hands hold her head, but her head is pressed against her bare shoulder here. Try doing that with your own face. It's nearly impossible to do. Her hands, I think, also tell us a story. One hand seems to be resting on top of his, but perhaps could be understood as kind of pulling his hand away gently, maybe with some force. Her other arm is thrown over her shoulder, his shoulder, on his neck, but it doesn't rest there. It almost looks as though it could be scratching his neck or his flesh. It's her pose is very ambiguous. So does knowing who the models were, would that help us understand what's unfolding here? Art historians generally agree that this could be a self-portrait of the artist, the male figure, and that the portrait of the woman was an image of a woman that he initially had a great deal of interest in, but it had cooled to a very long, solid friendship. But this could be an opportunity for him to express that initial sort of interest and passion that he had for her. Klimt himself had a very complicated relationship with women. He lived with his mother for his entire adult life, but he had sexual relationships with a lot of women. I wouldn't even call them romantic relationships. They were just sexual relationships. He fathered, I've read, 14 children by 14 different women, but he was always going home to his mother. So this image of what seems like the epitome of romantic love might be kind of crumbling before our very eyes. There's another reading of it, a mythological reading that's rooted in the fact that he is the male figure here is wearing a crown of laurel leaves. So he's been understood to be a representation of the god Apollo from classical antiquity, from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Apollo was known to have desired a nymph named Daphne. He chased after her, and in Bernini's famous Baroque sculpture over here from the 1600s, once he gets her, she transforms into a laurel tree. What he doesn't depict in this sculpture, of course, is that after Apollo gets Daphne, after she starts transforming into a tree, he kisses her. So perhaps this is the kiss, and perhaps this detail down here of these like branches or these roots extending from her body, perhaps that's her transforming into a laurel tree before our very eyes. Just the fact that her feet are rooted, her toes are rooted into the edge of this cliff here might tell us something as well. So a lot of different ways to read this. Certainly one of the most romantic images kind of falls apart once we look at it a little bit more closely, but we all have to put Vienna on our bucket list now, because this is another work that really holds a wall. It's about the same size as Whistler's Mother, approximately 6 feet by 6 feet. And with all that gold, apparently you can't take your eyes off of it. If you've been to the Louvre, you know the Mona Lisa can be a little disappointing, but apparently the kiss really rocks your world. So we're going to go from all this glittering gold in Austria to the American heartland and this grim-faced couple here. This is like the opposite of the kiss, right? This is Grant Wood's famous painting, American Gothic, featuring the farmer and his wife standing just behind him in front of their Carpenter Gothic style house, which was the inspiration for the entire painting. This was made in 1930, and it's in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. We're going to see how this painting can be interpreted in wildly different ways, and that is perhaps why it's still this kind of cultural touchstone for us today. So first off, I said, a farmer and his wife, ? Because we do know that the models for the painting were Grant Wood's sister and his dentist, and there was a big age difference between them. At one point, Grant Wood's sister, we'll talk about why a little bit later, said that this was in fact a painting of a farmer and his daughter. So that has led to a lot of questions over the years. But let's sort of dive into what we're looking at with this work. And I have these kind of helpful red symbols on the picture, because of course the third figure in this painting is the this pitchfork. It's closest to us, and we can see that it's a form that is repeated again and again in this picture, from the clothing to the face to the architecture itself. And of course, it literally stands between us and the couple who look so unwelcoming in themselves. So let's kind of take apart what we do see here. The most detailed part of this picture is this male farmer's face. It's grim, it's joyless, it's humorless. He seems to be looking out almost right at us, directly confronting us with the pitchfork in hand, essentially telling us, come no further. He's dressed, humbly, but he is wearing a jacket over his overalls. It is almost as though he was expecting company. Alongside him is this female figure who does not look out at us. She looks off to the side. She looks with this kind of furrowed brow. She looks concerned, as though there's something else that is occupying her mind other than our presence. Her clothing here is really out of date for the 1930s when this was painted as well. This rickrack edging to her apron was long out of style. The pattern here sort of echoes the curtain up here in the window. Another mythological reading on a familiar work. It has been said that this cameo at her neck is a depiction of Persephone, the goddess of the harvest and the queen of the underworld, goddess of the harvest. That would fit in perfectly with the pitchfork. But according to legend, Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, and the pitchfork in the hands of the farmer is just like Hades' trident. So perhaps there's that other layer of reading this. But when it was exhibited at a competition at the Art Institute of Chicago, it was immediately perceived to be like a joke, some satire that was essentially a send-up of these simple folk from the heartland. One of the judges called it a comic Valentine. Grant Wood's picture got some recognition at the time and was purchased by the institution, and then it became reproduced in newspapers all over the country. And by the time it was reproduced in Iowa, which is where the artist lived, there was this incredible ire, of huge backlash against it, because Iowans did not want to be perceived this way. They certainly didn't see themselves this way. They termed this as like a depiction of pinched, grim-faced, puritanical Bible thumpers. There were Iowan housewives who said that they wanted to punch Grant Wood in the face and bite off his ear, in particular because of the age difference between the husband and wife here, which is why Grant Wood's sister said, oh, it's the daughter, not the wife. But Grant Wood himself never said anything about the relationship here, but he did try to kind of save face, and he said that he had no ill intent in the way that he painted these individuals, that he had to go to France in order to really fully appreciate Iowans. But in subsequent years, this picture has sort of been this kind of bellwether in terms of how Americans are looking at each other and understanding each other. Now, this was painted right at the start of the Great Depression. And once the Great Depression takes hold, Whistler's mother becomes an icon, and this grim-faced couple also becomes an icon. They seem like salt of the earth people, hardworking people, the kind of people that you should celebrate during hard times when there's this kind of populist notion taking over the country. But ever since then, you still have cultural elites that look at this as a send-up of these people, that it is satire, that it's a joke intended to make fun of them. And as we go back and forth on the seesaw of how we interpret them, it does seem to have these resonating points with where we are as a culture, and how we think of each other, essentially. So the last couple we're going to look at is also one of these couples that can be seen sort of straddling the different sides of modernity and how we understand modernity. And of course, this last couple is the same person. It's Frida Kahlo's famous double portrait, The Two Fridas. This was painted in 1939. It's at the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City. And it's really Frida Kahlo's masterwork. It's roughly the same size as The Kiss and Whistler's Mother, about 6 feet by 6 feet. It's unusual for Frida Kahlo to paint on this scale because, of course, she suffered a horrible injury in a bus accident when she was 18 years old, broke many bones in her body, and was almost bedridden for most of her life because of subsequent surgeries and the pain resulting from that accident. So she primarily painted on an intimate, small level, and this was painted just as her career was taking off. It was time to create a big masterwork, and she painted what she knew best: her own self, her own face, and here she painted it with her famous facial hair. This was her pushing against the boundaries of what was considered sort of beautiful or sensual or appropriate for women of the time. This stoic, unflinching gaze that was probably inspired by some of the Catholic saints, images of Catholic saints that she grew up with her Catholic mother. But in the end, this is a uniquely Frida Kahlo painting. You know, as her career is on the rise, her marriage is falling apart. And this is really a painting about her heart and about her marriage. So she was married to an internationally renowned painter, a muralist named Diego Rivera. We can see the two artists here together. And they had an incredibly passionate and tumultuous marriage. It was an open marriage. And actually, the architecture of their designed house, I think, speaks a lot to the kind of lives that they wanted to lead. They essentially had their own homes, their own studios, and they were linked by this little walkway here. The blue house was Frida's, the white and pink was her husband's here. Now, all of this was seemingly working for them until Diego Rivera had an affair with Frida Kahlo's sister. That was just a bridge too far. And by the time the Two Fridas painting was finished, the couple had been divorced. And so this is really a picture of that heartache that came from that divorce, and a picture of sort of not just the modern Frida and the old-fashioned Frida, but the two Fridas in terms of her ethnic background too. She was half German, and so European, and half Spanish Mexican. And we see those two identities unfold here as well. So we see her heart's exposed, that she is linked by the veins or arteries here, and also by the fact that these two Fridas are holding hands. They are supporting each other. They are one and the same. Each of them also has a vein or an artery that extends underneath their arm and terminates on their lap. The European, or sort of old-fashioned Frida, has forceps in her hand, and she's seemingly trying to stave off bleeding. So there's a little puddle of blood on her lap that seems to trickle down and almost blend in with the details here at the hem of her dress. The other Frida is holding this little picture here. We'll zoom in here, the forceps, and then here is the painting in the modern Frida's hand. It's a painting, a little cameo of her husband, Diego. You can see his name down here. He's painted as a child, like the innocent version of the man who broke her heart. So we typically understand the two Fridas as a depiction of, you know, her separate identities, and you know, her trying to navigate kind of modernity and her past at the same time, but also a depiction of the Frida that he loved most, which was this modern version of Frida over here on the right. Now, even though it's a stormy background here, even though these women look like they're kind of hunkering down through this heartache, there's actually a happy ending to this story. Diego and Frida get remarried within the space of a year and stay together through the rest of Frida Kahlo's life. So they still had difficult times, that is to say, but at least they were reunited for that. So just to wrap up really quickly for tonight, our big ideas here. here, our takeaways, is that a little bit of mystery goes a long way, that we as a culture love images that can be debated, images that have no fixed meaning to them, no fixed reading, that can change with us as we change. We also love novel approaches to making art and making anything beautiful, whether it's the symbolic meaning of these carefully rendered flowers surrounding Ophelia or the modern crown of flowers in the kiss over here. There's always something that brings us back and makes us wonder about these works. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments that you might have about the iconic works that we've seen today. And I'll start looking at the chat here too.
So I don't think there's anything coming through the chat, but Anne
Okay.
Monahan has her hand up. Can I allow her to talk?
Sure.
Hi, Anne. Go ahead and ask your question. Just unmute yourself first. Hello, Anne.
Oh, we missed her. Sorry, we missed you, Anne. Feel free to type something if that's more comfortable for you.
Yeah.
Or if you can figure out how to unmute yourself.
There was also GD said, in Christina's world, isn't the current thinking that she has cerebral palsy? Or maybe you already answered that as you were talking.
She wrote MD, not CP. So I think the current thinking is that she had a degenerative muscular disorder. That's the latest that I've read. But I think for a long time people thought that she had polio, and I'm not even sure if, like, realistically we can medically diagnose her at this point. Right. But I think the current thinking is it was a muscular issue. Yeah.
Yes, the recording will go out tomorrow along with the advertisements for the upcoming programs that I mentioned at the beginning. But does anyone have any other questions? Why do they call it American Gothic?
Oh, because this is, well, that's okay. That actually touches on something I didn't even get to. I think probably because of the fact that what Grant Wood was trying to do here was to create a couple that looks like the kind of people that would be living in this, what was for the time, outdated architecture. The architecture of the house is called Carpenter Gothic. Oh. So he had them dressed in these old-fashioned clothes. He makes them really grim-faced, almost as though they're like waiting to get a photograph taken 50 years earlier. So I think that's really, I'm so glad you asked that, Jess, because I didn't circle back to that big issue right there. So thank you. Oh, Gigi.
Oh, that's so true. Okay. So there's a kiss question. Oh, in the kiss, it always seemed to me to be divided down the middle with rectangles and circles.
Oh, I can absolutely see that too. Let's see if we can go back there. I mean, that's certainly how the artist separates kind of the male body from the female body. And you could say a lot about, like, our associations with male bodies and female bodies, and curves versus things that are erect over here on the left. That's a good division that kind of splits the two. So that's a good thing to acknowledge there, Judy.
And then also, did you talk about proportions? Because it seems like if she stands up, she may be much taller than him.
That is a really good thing to note. And as you bring that up too, the fact that we don't see his legs either.
Yeah.
She would be
a
very, very tall figure if she were to stand up. I mean, he's sort of looming over her here with this incredibly long torso. So these are all really good things to point out, Jess. It's actually changing the way I look at this too. They have very unusual proportions.
And then and I also thought about Tristan and Isolde is another one that happens at a cliff. And before,
that's a great point. I'm gonna have to go back to that.
But I like the Apollo story though. That was really interesting. Catherine asks, in the Klimt, the one that we're looking at, have people discussed the feminine symbolism of the circles and the male phallic rectangle?
For sure. I'm glad that you made that a little bit more clear than I did in the program. But that, I mean, that's just such a, it's such a very clear way that the artist is trying to distinguish the male and the female here, circles versus rectangles. So I'm glad you emphasized that. But it's certainly been something that art historians have just gone straight to when they start analyzing this work.
All right. And then, yeah, so this is really fascinating, Jane. We're definitely going to be signing on for your part 2 of this
Oh,
presentation in January. Everyone just fab as usual. Of course, I will send this presentation out to everyone tomorrow once I download it and upload it to YouTube. And then we will, and then of course, I think that Jane welcomes any questions to her email
absolutely.
address, or you can send them to
Absolutely.
me and I will. Oh yeah, I thought about the glass thing too.
Oh, monoglass. Oh, that's an interesting association. I'm going to have to look more into that. I'm not that familiar with Murano glass.
Yeah, is that the one? It's like Spanish with the stones, the glass stones within the ceramic or something like that.
I think you're right.
Like Gaudi.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right, awesome. So I'll send this out to everybody with the programs and the announcements for the next time. And yeah, definitely reach out to Jane at iamculturallycurious.com. Her email is on that site. And if you have direct questions or comments, and we hope to see you all again on September 27th at 7 p.m.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Jane. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.